hello everybody. Well, after such an introduction, I guess we could skip the first several slides, but well, yeah, as to what I've been doing for the past time. Well, yes, plus 7 years in JavaScript and in front-end, and at that time mostly in fintech companies, and twice as much in working with HTML and CSS. And on the personal side, I experiment with sound design, and for the past several years it has become my main hobby. And beside that, I also like exploring different cinematic movements, different musical subgenres, and that kind of stuff. So that out of the way, let's move to our topic. So today we're going to talk about CSS architectures and various approaches. And because the topic itself is very big, I'll try to tell you something about in a more general sense, so that might be applied in various scenarios, not bound to some particular libraries or solutions. So let's then start with a story of growing complexity. Imagine you join a project where you need to develop a system of geometric shapes, and well, immediately you get a brief that, well, it may have an illustration, it may have some information that those shapes could have various sizes, various colors, etc. And well, at first you can figure out how you, well, could break this information into smaller pieces, into properties, and what methodologies to use to organize it further. So at this step, you will end up with a small UI kit, maybe a small design system that would evolve somehow in the future. So then some time passes, and imagine that the system evolves into something like this. Some composition is introduced, and now the shapes have some sort of relationships between each other. And at this point, you still can see how it could have evolved from the previous step. So all the basic shapes are visible, and the relationships between them can be reasoned about. And this could be an illustration to a development in progress. Then some more time passes, and the shapes that we've created are now used to create more complex shapes that also could have some dimensions to them. And to do this, we introduced some specific rules, some behaviors. So this could hold together and be used in various scenarios. And still, while the complexity has grown, we still could see the initial basic shapes, and still could reason about their boundaries. So this could be an illustration for, well, for a mature design system where there is some complexity, there is, well, maybe some optimization was also done at this point. Well, yeah, and all in all, this could be seen as a transparent system which could be easily picked up and managed. But imagine some more time passes and the system evolves into something like this. So at the first glance, it may look pretty and nice, and you might appreciate the work effort that was put into it. But probably this wouldn't be a project in a state which you would be happy to work with. Because even though we could still see the initial basic shapes, we can't really figure out if anything would break if we try to toggle something, or, well, yeah, how drastic would be the outcome of what we do when we work with such systems. So having described those 4 examples, I would like to outline a general roadmap of working with CSS projects, with design systems, with converting design to the code itself. So generally, we could outline the development process to 3 phases: the prototype phase, the design phase, and the optimization phase. Well, a maintenance phase, if you will. Taking the illustrations from the story that I've told, we could map the illustrations to those phases, something like this. The last step, well, I wouldn't say it really is a phase. It's more of a bad state of events, and because at this point it's much easier to move the project backwards than forward. But anyway, further down my presentation, I will focus on some stuff that might help you no matter on what stage you are in your project. To give some more context, the prototype phase is usually about experimenting, testing ideas, and because at this time, usually the outline of the project could be very vague and some changes could still be introduced, it is a good idea to start developing a flexible system which could be easily changed depending on how the project direction could respectively change. Okay, the second phase, during the second phase, you usually have enough code so you could reason about it, maybe look at some patterns that you could apply that could benefit the project. And at this point, you usually have some pain points which have amassed, during the time of the work. So it is a good idea to start tracking the approaches that you use, the design pattern that you use, the pain points. So you could always address it and not forget anything in your work process, and that collectively might give you some ideas of where to go from where to go to next. And the optimization phase is, at this point, usually you have a pretty diverse code base. So, most likely there is some redundant code coming from some third-party libraries. There might be some code repetitions. So it is a good idea to start using analyzers, some profilers on a regular basis, so you could easier track what's going on with the code in your project. Next, let's look at some guidelines that might help us solve some of this stuff that I've told you about. First, let's start with the atomic design principles. Has anybody worked with this paradigm? If by any chance you haven't heard of it, the basic idea is that you organize your components by complexity. It isn't really, it is more about components and not CSS in particular, but it is a good basis to organize your further code and, CSS also in mind. And to give a small refresher on the topic, the atoms are your most basic elements. Like inputs, buttons, labels, headers, etc. The molecules are sets of atoms. For instance, like a form field, which could have several entities inside it. And organisms and the top levels are different sets of those pieces. For example, the organism could be a form, a template could be a section of your page, and pages are pages. Next, I would like to mention two of the main CSS conventions that that are still widely used and, well, with various solutions in mind. So the first one, oh yes, one important note that is oftenly missed out, well, as I did now, that by the atomic design principles, you are not bound to use the namings and the initial 5 steps as your complexity. So you could align this specifically to your project. So you could have 4 layers, you could have 7 layers of complexity, and you could choose your own naming, so it would better fit the context of, well, of your code base. And going back to the CSS conventions, so one of them is the semantic CSS approach. The idea is that we have context-specific class names, and we use those, when using those class names for parent elements, we could use those class elements as prefixes to the child classes. And the pro of this approach is that it gives a good structure and the context is very readable, but the downside to this is that we tend to have a lot of code repeats. Well, style property repeats like padding, like fonts, like some box model properties. And, well, yeah, some famous examples of this in some senses would be BEM, Bootstrap, Semantic UI. The other convention is called utility-first CSS. The idea behind is that you use a single style property per class, and that way we could keep our code base as dry as possible. Well, because those properties are not repeated, and well, always address those utility classes that we've created. But the downside to this is that we could have very verbose class chains, especially with elements which could have state or multiple Media query instances. And the most famous example would be Tailwind CSS. You've probably all heard of it, maybe even worked with it. But the other libraries worth mentioning would be Tations and CSS. Well, those are kind of a bit later takes on this approach. And also, I would like to tell you about one CSS architecture convention. Well, it's not that widely famous, but you still may have heard of it. It's called the ITCSS. IT stands for inverted triangle. And the idea behind this is that we layer our styles by context. And on the top levels, we have the more general properties, classes, and the lower we get, the more specific the context becomes. To give a better example of this, the top 2 levels are generally variables and mixins. Well, yeah, basically this you could set it up yourself. It could easily come from some libraries like Normalize, and well, yeah, a lot of CSS frameworks have this implemented by default. The next layers are CSS resets and HTML defaults. Well, yeah, this is generally the stuff that also comes out of the box with most of the solutions. Well, yeah, so this step and the previous one. And the last 3 layers are more class-oriented. So they either could be agnostic, like a UI list or a form, or they could be more specific and bound to some business context, like a top navigation or a product list. And also the more specific layer is the modifiers of those classes. So having said all this, how could we make use of all this information? For instance, we could take the atomic design principles as our basis for our components, for our styles. We could change the layers to better suit our current project. So, for instance, here in the external category, we could keep all the third-party stuff so that it could be, so it would have one source of truth and could be easier maintained through the whole project. The principles and the sets will have our most basic building blocks, and UI agnostic and UI semantic will have some specific classes. Well, some more specific, not exactly classes, but components of our system. To this, we could apply the first four layers of the ITCSS principles and make them accessible to all the layers of our components. Well, yeah, so the resets and HTML will be available to the whole system by default. And the variables and mixins, like, for instance, something from your design system, could be set globally. Well, yeah, so on all levels, they would be available. And at this point, you could start building a UI kit or a design system. And from the start, you would be having your code base very dry, so you wouldn't have to take care of it later. But this introduces another problem that using only utility classes, we get a lot of code repeats in our well, in our class chains. And well, this is also a repetition, and we still could optimize it further, and we could implement another layer to which we could abstract those repeating patterns. So we're taking the other three layers of ITCSS, and afterwards we're looking for some repeating patterns in the components and see if we could abstract them to some more general class calls. For example, in Tailwind, this could be easily done with the apply helper function, but if you're using CSS and JS, you could basically concatenate this to kind of more general namespaces. Okay, so, well, and this could be taken, for instance, as a blueprint for a CSS architecture, and, well, maybe modify it at some later points, maybe build something of your own, but it is a good idea to have something like this, so all the team and all the newcomers could easier visualize what's going on in your code base. So to give some examples on what I've said, here's an example of a very verbose class chain. And, well, if you're working with this on a day-to-day basis, you, well, most probably will not have a problem with this. But if you touch it every once in a while, or if someone new comes to the team, sorry. Well, it could be easy to lose focus on what's going on. And in these cases, it is a good idea to abstract, well, not to abstract, but to move those class calls to a separate entity. Well, for example, move them to a template literal, so we could have a cleaner component declaration. And because all the classes are now in a single column, it's much easier to read and to reason about what's going on here. Okay, so for example, when we have, well, when having our classes better organized, it's much easier to spot some repeats, and afterwards we could abstract them, well, in this example with Tailwind, to some more general classes. So here we use a flex row and the horizontal alignment vertical alignment. as a one set called the row group, and the other one abstracts to styles of padding. Well, because this stuff tends to be repeated a lot through your project. So in the component, we could apply it something like this. So the upper code demonstrates how it was done on the step without the semantic layer, and the bottom example shows how it could be done using the semantic layer. And also we could mix those abstracted classes with the utility ones, and sorry, lost my thought.
Would be utility ones?
Yeah. Yeah. So the repeated stuff is abstracted, but the stuff that that is unique, it is chained to the more general classes. Still, we could abstract this even more and make a combo of a agnostic class and maybe some utility class, and have a more context-specific class. Here at this point, we apply the row as a composite class, and the utility classes that we need in some particular case. And so at the component level, we could have clean, concise class names. There is a point. Well, not a point, but there is something to keep in mind using this approach, because if you have a lot of class abstractions, like for instance with apply, you start to have your system less dry. So, some stuff starts to be repeated, and this is something good to keep in mind and to keep track of, so you could balance it out while you're working on your system. The other example I would also like to discuss is more variable-oriented, CSS variable-oriented. So, for instance, to reduce some style overrides, we could use CSS variables. We still could do something like this in the CSS and JS solutions, but the idea is that we declare our variables with the defaults, and we set those dynamic variables in various states. For instance, here we're not overriding, but we are giving a value to the initial declaration. So if a value is given, then the value is applied, but if not, then it falls back to the default value. And furthermore, we could even set variables inside variables. So, for instance, later we could create something like preset classes that we could chain to our, in specific places. For example, here from the previous step, we have the hover color and focus color made available, and in a preset class we could set all those three variables, and they will be picked up by the CSS processor. So if we set our smaller pieces with such sets, declaring the variables and whatnot, the scope chain in the parent classes, we could make even bigger preset lists. Well, for instance, here we change the styles of an input and of a label. And also this could be picked up in the media queries where you would need them. And actually, also to keep in mind that one thing to keep in mind is that using a lot of variables might give you performance hits and penalties. So it is a good idea to scope them, and also to keep track of them. So you could gain good performance. Okay, and having described those two examples, I would also like to mention some tools that might come in handy. There are quite a lot, different analyzers, areas, various profiling tools. And if you don't have any favorites, I would suggest starting with a CSS overview tool. It is available in all WebKit browsers. And well, basically to get to this, you need to run the command prompt while having the development tools open. To open the command prompt, it's Command-Shift-P on Mac and Control-Shift-P on Windows. There you should find the Show CSS Overview. And out of the box, it gives you a lot of statistics on CSS in your current page. And, well, here you could find stuff like the accessibility information for your colors, for your fonts, that might shed some light on what you need to fix in your project. Also, here you could see the unused declarations of classes and where to find them. So at its basics, it might come in pretty handy when you need it. And the other tool that I would also like to suggest, it's called Project Wallace. And well, initially it is a web service to which you could copy-paste well, your CSS code or a link to your CSS, but also it has a CLI tool, which might be more suitable for for any project. And it gives much more statistics than the CSS overview. But again, depending on what specific pieces you want to track, well, it might be handy. Well, maybe not. Okay, so the takeaways from all this is that you could reduce your code, your CSS by using variables and utility classes. So keeping your system more dry and initially more utility-oriented. You could organize your styles by semantics, by purpose and context. So it would have a more readable structure, more reasonable structure. You could use profiling tools to track the redundancies and some errors that might occur when your system grows big. You can use stylint and prettier to keep your code clean and concise. And if you're keeping a doc on what's going on in your project and checking your pain points, checking why you've made certain decisions, then this would be a pretty solid base for a big flexible CSS project. Some references that I would also like to mention and recommend. There's a really cool survey called the State of CSS. It is a yearly event, and the information is gathered through the whole year, and the results are summarized and give some statistics on what trends are currently trendy and what technologies are used and popular. There you could find some really thorough stats on what's going on with various solutions, various trends. And this might be a good source to pick up some new ideas, maybe for your current project, maybe for your future projects. And also, I would really like to recommend this article. It's called "The Evolution of Scalable CSS," and it has much more information on what I've told you about today. For instance, it goes pretty deep on all of these topics, like the atomic CSS is the utility-first CSS. It also tells about the CSS pre-processors and post-processors, and Well, yeah, I would say that this article covers everything that you should know about the CSS and what you might apply in the future. And also, there are, well, by this QR code, you could get a full list of references that I've used to create this presentation. And, well, yeah, thank you.